Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night, depending on where you are in the world. I have been looking forward to doing this particular live stream for a long time. I'm going to be having and be joined very shortly by Glenn Scrivener, whom I will let him introduce himself. And we're going to be talking about secular humanism, secularism, Christianity, and the modern world. A kind of, what has Christianity done for us and what does it all mean kind of thing. If you think that what I'm doing is useful, helpful, then please hit the like button. Do that in every live stream. Please hit the share button. Do that in every live stream. Get this shared on social media. And, remember to hit the subscribe button as well, please. And finally, if you want to support what I'm doing, all the links are in the description box. So without further ado, because we've got a lot to talk about and, not enough hours to talk about it, I would like to bring on my very special guest, Glenn Scrivener. How are you?
I'm doing very well, Bob. Thank you for having me.
I think I should call you Pilot Glenn with such a jacket.
Are you Pixie Bob, though? I mean,
no, definitely not Pixie Bob.
We're both in different outfits.
I love the Anglo-Indian look. I love Anglo-Indian fashion. So, if I could dress like I was in sort of like Anglo-Indian clothes all the time, I would. But nothing beats that bomber jacket, like that pilot's jacket. Looks
You're
incredible.
very kind, Bob. Thank you.
Right. So today we were going to put up a video, but we're having a bit of a technical glitch. And the topic, obviously, as you know, is we're going to talk about secularism, Christianity in the modern world. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to, after we've prayed, offer you the floor to start talking. And I'll write down my questions and then we'll have a discussion around it. But as always, as our custom, we're going to open with a prayer and you're going to read a psalm as our opening prayer. So if you want to read the psalm all the way through, and that will be our prayer to begin.
Awesome. So I chose Psalm 24, a psalm of ascension. I love it. Of David, a psalm. The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it, for he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters. Who may ascend the mountain of the Lord? Who may stand in his holy place? The one who has clean hands and a pure heart, who does not trust in an idol or swear by a false god. They will receive blessing from their Lord and vindication from God their Savior. Such is the generation of those who seek him, who seek your face, God of Jacob. Lift up your heads, you gates, be lifted up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is this King of glory? The Lord, strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Lift up your heads, you gates, lift them up, you ancient doors, that the King of glory may come in. Who is he, this King of glory? The Lord Almighty. He is the King of glory.
This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
So, Glenn, I'm going to just hand you the floor, and if you want to kick us off on the topic.
Okay, well, maybe a way into the topic is to think about something that's occupying a lot of my headspace at the moment, and a lot of us in the UK are thinking about the assisted dying bill that is being debated on Friday in the House of Commons. Here, it's a free vote, so you don't have to vote according to party lines. You vote only according to your conscience. And what the proposed legislation would do would be to open the door to assisted suicide. The word suicide is not used in the bill. It's assisted dying, is the language that's being used, but it is physician-assisted suicide. They prescribe, as a therapeutic intervention, death, and that the patient would then be enabled to kill themselves in certain circumstances. They could kill themselves in the circumstance of they're terminally ill. It is adjudged that they have only 6 months to live. They're in unremitting pain, and that it's signed off by 2 doctors, and that it is your settled decision over the course of 2 weeks. But with those stipulations in place, it would open the door to, I think, a different state of affairs in Britain. I think certainly for those who make it out of the womb, and perhaps we can talk about the unborn and the fact that their right to life has not been affirmed since 1967 in this country. But certainly for those who have made it out of the womb, the UK has, through its laws, said that every single member of the human family is worthy of provision and protection, and that their life is valuable no matter who says otherwise. And even if the person themselves, tragically, thinks that the world is better off without them, we as a society say no, and love says no, and love shuts the door on that particular option and says whatever other options you have, and we want to give you all the options in the world, the one option that you don't have is to rid the world of yourself. We need you too much. You have a sanctity to you. You have a sacred value. And life is a gift, and it is not yours to dispose of. And you can tell which side of the debate I'm on, having set the thing up in that way. I'm on the side of those who believe in the sanctity of life, and that's probably the sort of the chief pillar of the foundations of where I stand on this question of physician-assisted suicide, that our lives are not our own, but that we have an inviolable worth and dignity that comes from beyond us. And therefore, I believe strongly in the sanctity of life, that I think is a quasi-secular way. It's not very secular because, sanctity is the word sacred, but it is still a quasi-secular way of talking about the image of God, that all human beings are made in the image of God and have an inviolable, innate, inherent worth and dignity that is not to be traded off against other goods in society. So that puts me on that side of the debate. What's interesting is that on the other side of the debate are those who want to prioritize the right to choose. And I think the right to choose, while the way in which it is forwarded is a very post-Christian belief, the origins of that, the origins of those beliefs in rights, the origins of the beliefs in the individual and our individual liberty, and the idea that humans ought to have agency over their lives, I think the genealogy of that idea traces back to completely profoundly Christian truths. And what we are going to witness on Friday, as they debate this bill for 5 hours in Parliament, I think will be Christian-ish versus other less Christian, but still Christian-ish views. And I think it's a case of, welcome to the year 2024. In the year 2024, we still have the profound influence of the Jesus Revolution that has given us things like the belief in the equality of all people and the inviolable worth and dignity of all people, human rights, the individual, but also things like expressive individualism, right? Because as we have divorced ourselves ever more from the Christian story, we have beliefs that are still kind of Christian-ish, or at least in the shape of them, in the way that they are presented. They are presented in some Christian-ish clothing, even if what is being proposed is thoroughly unchristian. And it's interesting that even the most unchristian propositions still need to be spoken and expressed in the language of rights, in the language of choice, in the language of compassion. And what we have in our society is we are hurling Bible verses at each other. We've just forgotten the references. So the book that I wrote back in 2022 is called The Air We Breathe, and I take the title really from an experience that I had back in Australia. So I grew up in Australia. I've lived more than half my life in the UK, but I never recognized how sweetly Australia smelt until I went back into Australia from the outside. And when you touch down in Sydney and the plane door opens, you smell this air that's been sort of mentholated by all the eucalyptus trees, and it's like a cough syrup carried upon the breeze. It's a very sweet smell. Of course, when you live in Australia, you don't notice all the eucalyptus oil in the air. You only notice it when you come out of that environment and are placed back inside that ecosystem, and then you recognize the strangeness of the air that you'd always been breathing. And I think you can do the same with morals. I think you can do the same with our deepest convictions about right and wrong, about the just society, about the meaning of life and death and value. I think all of these are like the air that we breathe. They appear to us as obvious, natural, universal. But actually, you never really recognize how distinctive the moral universe is that you live in. You don't notice how peculiar your moral presuppositions are until you come out of that society and then go back into that society. And so what I attempt to do in the book, The Air We Breathe, is I could have taken people out of kind of Western culture and put them into sort of cultures that had not been evangelized by the Christian gospel. Instead, I decided to do the history thing and go back in time, and especially go back to the ancient world and to figure out what it was like to stand in the sandals of the Roman centurion as he's thrusting a spear up into the side of this rebel. To think yourself into his shoes is to think yourself into a completely different moral and theological and existential atmosphere. It's to breathe some very, very different air. And what I want to do in the book is show people that actually the air that Roman soldier breathed was incredibly different. And the thing that has transformed the way we see life and death and meaning and value and choice and all these things is really because of that man on the cross. That he has effected a revolution in the way that all of us see the world, whether we're Christian or not. And that for 2,000 years, meditation on the figure on the sharp end of that spear, meditation on him as the Lord, meditation on him as the highest, the most transcendent, has been a moral revolution that has really no precedent and no parallel. Friedrich Nietzsche, the Prussian philosopher, he said that the cross, the God on the cross is the transvaluation of all ancient values. Ancient values are to prize the strong and to despise the weak. And an ancient person like that centurion holding the spear thought that what was glorious was to enforce the hierarchy of Rome, and he thought he was preserving the Pax Romana, the peace of Rome. He thought he was living wisely within the hierarchy, playing the hand that had been dealt to him. And if an innocent man dies, that really doesn't matter as long as the peace of Rome is maintained. There's no such thing as individual rights. There's no such thing as equality. There's no such thing as compassion. There is no, and there is no glory to being a victim. There is no cachet to being marginalized and weak and downtrodden and all that. You're just a loser. And so the Roman soldier would have, until he recognized, this truly is the Son of God, until he recognized that, his whole moral worldview is a dominance worldview, hierarchy, inequality woven into the natural state of things. It's very interesting to think that the first depiction of crucifixion in the ancient world was a piece of graffiti, and it's scratched into the Palatine Hill, into a wall of the Palatine Hill there in Rome, where the Caesars lived. And we think it's probably from the 2nd century. And as this burgeoning Jesus movement gets going, a Roman is mocking the Christians and their views. And so what he does is he draws Christ on the cross, but he gives him the head of a donkey, because only an ass of a god would deign to stoop to this implement of torture. And so there's Christ on the cross with the head of a donkey, and off to one side is a worshipper, and he's sort of raising his hand in veneration towards Christ. And the caption just says, "Alexamenos worships his God." And you can just feel the spite in that. You can just feel, even across 2,000 years, I think the comedy holds up. It's very hard for comedy to hold up even over decades, but I think the comedy, kind of the spite at least, the sarcasm, the bite of it really holds up over 2,000 years as you, again, you put yourself in the shoes of a Roman citizen. You look to the cross, or you hear Christians praise the crucified one as their Lord and their God, and you just think these people are morally imbecilic and intellectually imbecilic. And it's an utter transvaluation of all values, because the Romans thought that every day you should do something to help your friends and harm your enemies. And that's kind of the way nature works as well. Evolutionary psychologists will talk about, in-group amity and out-group enmity, right? In-group, we're going to be, kind and compassionate to a degree towards our own. We are going to cooperate. We're going to have pro-social behavior in order that we can smash the out-group. And every day you should do something to help your friends and harm your enemies is sort of homespun wisdom that would not raise an eyebrow in any ancient culture at all. And in nature, what you have is the survival of the fittest, and therefore the sacrifice of the weakest. At the cross, what you see is the sacrifice of the fittest, Jesus Christ, in order that we, the weakest, might survive, and not only survive but thrive and pass on his compassion revolution. And those who see the cross in this new light, just like that centurion who, according to Mark's Gospel in chapter 15, his eyes are opened at the end of all things to see, oh, truly this man was the Son of God. When you look at the cross a second time and you think to yourself, no, he is not a wretch, he is reigning, he is not a loser, he is Lord. When you look to the cross and you think that is the most divine thing I've ever seen, it's the transvaluation of all ancient values. And all of a sudden, it's not the survival of the fittest and the sacrifice of the weakest. It's the sacrifice of Christ the fittest, but it's also me called to shoulder my cross and now use whatever privileges I have, not to dominate, but to serve, and to serve those without. And the compassion revolution that was born in the early church is phenomenal. All of a sudden, you have the birth of charity in the way that we nowadays think of charity. Some benefactors in Rome might throw some bread to the masses and, put on some gladiatorial games for the masses. They might erect statues in honor of themselves. They might offer money to display their magnanimity. But the idea of serving the poor for the sake of the poor That was a profound shift in understanding. And it comes through Christians kind of believing in this strange story of God on a cross. And Christians started to see he is the image of God with a capital I. But hang on, haven't the scriptures always said that we are in the image of God with a little I? And didn't Jesus say to us, when you go out and serve the poor, I'm thinking of Matthew chapter 25, for instance, when you clothe the needy and feed the hungry and visit the imprisoned, Jesus says, you're feeding me. He kind of hides himself in the weak and the poor and the needy so that we can love Jesus by loving the poor. We can love Jesus by expending ourselves for those on the outside. And this births a fundamentally different view of charity. It births things like hospitals. The Romans had hospitals for their slaves and their soldiers, but they were basically sick bays so that you could return your slave or your soldier to economic fruitfulness or military fruitfulness. They didn't have hospitals for the poor as the poor, for the sick as the sick. But all of a sudden, you get this compassion revolution. Suddenly you get orphan care. Because in Roman society, you would obviously not want to raise children who are difficult to raise. The very first manual of midwifery in the first century in Rome, chapter 1 is on how to discern the offspring that is worth raising. Right? First things first. If you're going to bring life into the world, you need to figure out if this kid is worth raising or not. And the first job of the midwife is to have a look and see if they are robust enough for life. And if they're disabled, probably chuck them out. And if they're female, then they're at great risk of being exposed, being placed on a rubbish dump or drowned in a river or thrown down a well. And yet Christians started to be the ones who saved such children from that fate. And then what will they do now with these orphans? Well, they will raise them, and orphan care started to be a profoundly different thing with Christians. And those were some of the things that Christians started in the early church. They started things like orphan care and hospitals and charity, but there are also some things they stopped, like the gladiatorial games eventually, because you can't have two images of God just throwing their lives away like this. They started to stop things like pederasty. So pederasty, the Greek word for child love, Christians and Jews had called this child destruction. It's child abuse. This sexualization of children, it was utterly outlawed. They wanted to stop that. They stopped infanticide as well, and they legislated against it. And so what you get with this Jesus revolution is a profoundly humanistic revolution. I think, let's reclaim the name humanism. I'm a Christian humanist. And actually, I think there's no other kind, because how else are you going to have the highest place for humanity unless you have God the human, Jesus Christ? I don't think there is a humanism outside of Christian humanism. But I'm content with all those caveats to call myself a humanist, and I think these reforms have been profoundly humanistic reforms. I think we can come through into medieval times, and as Christians started to reflect on the image of God in all people, they started to develop a language around rights and human rights. They developed notions like just war. They developed the idea of the individual, that I'm not just part of a collective, and therefore my rights can't just get lost in the shuffle. I am, well, in the church, I am a child of God, baptized, and I have a personal relationship with the Lord Jesus. And politically, that starts to have an impact in Christianized society. And Larry Seidentop, the political philosopher, talks about the invention of the individual, and Christendom was really a time when we stopped thinking about natural inequality woven into society, and we stopped thinking in collective terms about the the natural unit of social organization. We started to think not in terms of the family as being the natural unit of social organization. We started to think about the individual as the natural unit of human organization. And I think there's wonderful things about that. We'll get on to where that leads in a minute. But I think, the invention of things like parliaments are just a wonderful thing. The invention of things like universities are just wonderful. And then you come through into, I think at the Reformation you have this profound sense of Scripture stands above every institution, even the church, such that the plain teaching of Scripture to my conscience is cause for one medieval monk to stand against both emperor and pope. And the Reformation developed within the West a real sense of the individual, a real sense of the rights of conscience, and further developments kept on going. The scientific revolution was another major one. The image of God, again, is at the heart of that revolution, because why should this 3 pounds of grey matter have any purchase on the mysteries of the cosmos? I'm made in the image of God. Homo sapiens actually does have a right to and can expect to understand something of the laws of nature, because we've been made in the image of the lawgiver. And it's no coincidence that Christian people at Christian universities undertaking natural philosophy via some very Christian methods and presuppositions develop what we think of now as the modern scientific method. You come forward in history, and one of the great evils in Christian history has been, the transatlantic slave trade. Throughout Christendom, slavery melted away largely, especially in Western Europe. In France, it was completely outlawed in 1315. But largely in Western Europe, it had gone completely. With the sort of the slow ferment of certain theological beliefs, and they slowly had an impact on society. Unfortunately, with the opening up of the New World, slavery came back with a vengeance in the most egregious kinds of ways, and the Dutch and the Portuguese and the Spanish and the British did not cover themselves in glory at all. The possibility for riches far outstripped any Christian virtue that they had. And slavery has been a human universal in any society that's gotten to any level of development. But I think the transatlantic slave trade was a particularly egregious form of race-based chattel slavery, which went on for 350 years, and about 12 million West Africans were trafficked and died in those 350 years. And that was a tremendous blight on the church. And in my book, The Air We Breathe, I'm constantly talking about the shadow side of the church and many of the things that Christians have gotten wrong over the years. But it is an extraordinary moral development to have such a thing as abolition. If slavery is a human universal, the fact that evangelicals and Quakers, again, standing on the doctrine of the image of God, brought about a real moral upheaval and a transformation, the likes of which it's hard to think of parallels in terms of such a corner being turned in the moral outlook of millions of people. But I think the abolition of the transatlantic slave trade is perhaps the biggest seismic shift in the moral presuppositions of millions of people all at once. And David Bryan Davis and these historical experts in the transatlantic slave trade. David Bryan Davis is the preeminent historian, one of his great books on the abolition of the slave trade is called The Image of God, and completely noticing that it's that doctrine, when preached, that convicted Christian slavers and Christian bystanders and brought about an incredible transformation. So my book sort of traces all these kinds of developments, and if you're asking the question, as Bob asked earlier, what have the Christians ever done for us? Echoing, what have the Romans ever done for us from Monty Python's Life of Brian? I think I must have listed, 15 things there. Charity, hospitals, hospices, orphan care, abolition of infanticide, abolition of gladiatorial games, abolition of pederasty, establishment of things like human rights and just war and the individual and parliaments and universities and scientific method, abolition of the slave trade. All these things are, if an organization was responsible for just one of those examples of moral progress, we would hail them as the most humanistic organization going. The fact that the church is hailed for all of these things, well, the church is responsible for all of these things, but it is not hailed as a progressive movement at all. I think it should be uncontroversial to call the Church of Jesus Christ the greatest movement for social reform and human flourishing in history. I don't see how that is controversial, actually. What people might want to bring up, and I'm certainly open to questions, is what about all the bad stuff, including weren't many of these slavers Christians? Yes, there are those shadow sides. But what I do in the book is I come up with 7 different values that I think Christianity has kind of given to the world because they've meditated on that man on the cross and the implications of Christ and him crucified. They are equality, compassion, consent, enlightenment, science, freedom, and progress. And I think one of the ways you can see that those 7 values are transcendent moral values for us is because what do you call a thing that is unequal, cruel, coercive, unenlightened, anti-science, restrictive, and regressive? What do you call such a thing? Well, that's the worst. Why is that the worst? Because we do recognize that those things are kind of the best. And even our critiques of Christianity tend to be Christian-ish critiques, saying that the church is not equal enough or compassionate enough, etc. And so let's just, to cut a long story short, because I'm sure lots of people have questions, let's bring it back to Friday and the assisted dying bill. Because what I think we have are 2 sides. One side saying sanctity of life, the other side saying right to choose. Now, the right to choose side, I think, have derived their views from certain Christian presuppositions. The idea of the individual, the idea that I have rights, the idea that compassion is this kind of superordinate value, the idea of consent, that people are not property and they should to some degree be in charge of their own lives. All of these ideas have come to us through a very distinctive historical process through Christianity. Now, you can take these values and you can divorce them from the Christian story and divorce them from one another and recombine them. And then what you get is, I am a sphere of sovereignty all my own. I don't belong to God. I don't belong to anyone else. I belong only to me. And it's my free choices that are the epitome of my humanity. They are what defines me as a human, and don't tell me what to do. The kind of way in which that view gets expressed in terms of, but we have a right to choose, and isn't it compassionate to end the suffering of people. Those things have come to us via a very Christian history, but they've been divorced from the Christian story, and those values have been divorced from one another. But there still might be value in pulling at the threads of, oh, okay, so you do believe in compassion. Why? Oh, okay, so you do believe that we're individuals. Why? You do believe we have rights. Why? You do believe that we should, to some degree, be in charge of our lives, and that our rights shouldn't be lost in the shuffle of the collective. Why? It's still worth, I think, pulling at those threads, because I think, historically and theologically, at the other end of those threads is that man on that cross. And I think it's worth us understanding all sides in political arguments. And it's worth understanding what is it that's Christianish, what is it that's utterly pagan. And you know, I do think that suicide in other cultures is commonplace. Infanticide is commonplace, right? We are practicing some very pagan things. I'm not saying everything we do is Christian. We are practicing some incredibly pagan things. But we see them through a Christianish prism, and we clothe them in Christianish clothing. And it's worth paying attention to that if we're going to understand 2024, and if we're going to help secular people discover that, A, they are believers already. They believe in things really profoundly. You know, my secular friends, they believe in human rights, and they believe in human rights even more than they believe that this is a godless universe. They'll tell you this is a godless universe. They'll also say they believe in human rights. Human rights do not work in a godless universe at all. And they lean into the human rights thing a lot more than they lean into the godless universe thing. And part of what I do as an evangelist, I'm a Christian evangelist, and I want to lead people to Christ, is sometimes I want to say to those secular people, can you pull at the thread of the human rights that you so love? Can you pull at the thread of the compassion ethic that you so love? I think you will find Jesus on the other end of that. I don't so much want you to take a leap of faith. I want you to recognize you're in midair, buddy. you are trying to establish a kingdom in the air without the king, without Christ. Can I provide some ground beneath your feet? Can I introduce you to Jesus? I think he is where a true compassion ethic is found. He is where your true sense of the individual is found. He is where all these values are truly found. Let's take it all back to Jesus. So I've rambled for quite some time, but Bob, I'm sure you've got loads of questions, and I'm sure others have loads of questions too.
Well, the others aren't going to get a look in unless I've finished with what I want to talk about. So, just explain to people who are watching this why the idea of a profound commitment to a value system or truth claims makes no sense in a godless world.
And I think, okay, let's take a belief in human rights. What do you have to believe in order to believe that all humans, all members of the human family, no matter rich or poor, weak or strong, all humans have an inviolable worth and dignity, and they have an equal moral worth and dignity? Because if you take any two human beings and you judge them by any one metric, what you're going to discover is difference.
Yeah, they're
this
not
person
equal.
is stronger than this person. This person is richer than that person. In what sense are they equal? Equal how? Like, to an
This
ancient
person
philosopher.
is contributing more to society than that person.
Right. They have, like, this person, like, Elon Musk is worth however many billion. Like, what is it? 200 billion? More than 200 billion, probably.
Richest man in the world.
Richest man in the world. Okay. But is that what he is worth? Is that his value? And we instinctively say, oh, no, he's just the same as the street sweeper. But he's not, is he? Or is he? Like where? In what sense? Judged by what standard is Elon Musk the same as the street sweeper? It can't be anything that you can discover scientifically.
Agreed.
And so, like, this idea of equality, only really works if you've got equality in the eyes of God. Otherwise, absolutely, your value to society. Some people can do a lot more for society than others. How are you going to
So it's not.
ground something?
So what we're saying is that it's not. Yeah. I think you put your finger on it quite well. That by every scientific measurable metric, people are not equal, but yet we want to affirm that people are equal. So we have to appeal to an authority that is outside of a scientific worldview or an empirical measure. And so what authority are we appealing to? And as Christians, we're appealing to God, whereas the godless, well, what authority are they appealing to?
And I think as a Christian, I'm appealing to a very particular God.
Yes.
The kind of God who took flesh and became human in order to invite me. So God the Son, in Christian theology, God the Son becomes God our brother. And he takes our death upon himself and he rises up again to invite us into his family, in which all of us are brother and sister, and nobody is a Lord except him. And that particular Christian theology, that particular Christian story, which I think is a true story, but I think that is unlike, you could go to many religious views in the world, and they do have the hierarchical caste system.
Yep. Hinduism,
And
Islam.
right, yeah, and yeah, and so you are born into certain castes, and the equalization might happen in the next life, but woven into our lives. Intentionally is that kind of inequality, and I don't think you get a particular regard for the human. Certainly anywhere as much as you get it in Christianity. We believe in God the human, and what we believe is that the God the human, Jesus Christ, who is the Son of the Father, filled with the Spirit, he takes on our humanity, puts our old man to death, puts all that is corrupt about us, because when we say humanity, we don't always mean our better angels. We sometimes talk about our inner demons, don't we? And what Christ does on that cross is bear the curse and judgment for our inner demons, rise up again, and he's seated at the right hand of the Father is what the psalm was all about that I read at the beginning. Psalm 24 is all about, the Lord Jesus Christ ascends to the highest place, which means that Christians really believe that there is a humanity that is pure. It's not mine and it's not yours, Bob. But there is a true humanity, which is kind of what my friends all reach for when when anyone talks about, crimes against humanity. Okay, the Nazis committed crimes against humanity, and you're like, well, but they were humans. Like Nazis were humans, and they were, and it was a human who did that evil to the other human, the Jew, and then other humans put them on trial for crimes against humanity, and you're just like, well, at that stage, if it's a perfectly secular worldview, at that stage you've got humanity as the judge. Humanity is the accused. Humanity is the victim. This case would be thrown out of court.
Humanity is the criminal.
And humanity, yeah, exactly. Humanity is the criminal, and humanity is the judge. In what sense were the Nazis inhumane? They were human too, right? I think on Christianity,
if anything, when you look at the grand scope of history, they sit the Nazi atrocities and evils sit better within the broad scope of history,
yes,
than holding them to account. In other words, human civilization has been more like the brutality of the Nazis than the Christian concept. And I think what this draws out, Glenn, is that there is an underpinning of doctrine to values that the liberal secular world has forgotten. They want to uphold values, but they can't rationalize through a doctrinal prism or a doctrinal basis the values that they hold. They're literally just borrowing Christian values
Yeah.
But they eschew the Christian doctrines that make those values make sense.
Yeah.
And
100%.
I would say that as we've progressed down this liberal secular route, and we've forgotten that the idea of the value of the moral equality of humans
Yeah.
is rooted in the image of God. Human beings have started to lose their moral equality. And now what we see in the liberal world is we've got some humans being rated as higher and more important than others. And wherever the doctrine of the image of God is not found, you end up with caste systems, dimitude, racial apartheids, and now, a pyramid of victims, in critical theory. Because we don't look at people as having moral equality.
Yeah.
Because we
Yeah.
don't hold to the doctrine of the image of God in the West.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I talk in the book about Matthew 13, and it's just fascinating, isn't it? Jesus tells this story about how his kingdom is going to grow. And, if that centurion was overhearing Jesus as he was, teaching, he would have chuckled to himself, thinking, like, who does this penniless preacher think he is? He's going to take over the world, apparently. And, his little mustard seed is going to somehow grow into the largest plant and take over the field and be the biggest movements that the world has ever seen. Jesus absolutely predicts it and affects it.
And the church has lived it out.
And the church has lived it out. And what's interesting is that he says, the mustard seed grows into the mustard tree, and the birds perch in its branches. Interestingly, the very beginning of Matthew 13, Jesus begins his parables about the seeds. And he talks about, when the seed first goes out, the birds come along and gobble it up. The birds are so much bigger than the seed. And Jesus kind of relates that to satanic opposition is going to come after. The gospel is going to go out, and this satanic opposition is going to seem so much bigger than the seed and gobble it all up. Then you get to the very end of Matthew 13. By the end of Matthew 13, the seed has really done its work. And the kingdom has been grown, and now the birds are kind of perched on a branch of the tree that the message of Jesus has grown. And I think that's a perfect example of modern secular people. They're still probably pecking at the tree, and they're still saying it's unequal and it's cruel, and blah, 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 all the while
They're like desperate woodpeckers.
pecking on the branch where they're perched.
And I think that is the right way to interpret our world, for Christians, certainly from a theological point of view, is that the kingdom of God has transformed the world, and yet the demons who are nestling in its branches and standing on its teachings nonetheless oppose what it stands for. And an example of that would be slavery. You've got the fact, and I just want to read a church father, because you mentioned that it's throughout meditation and our reflection upon the life of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus as embodied in the writings of the apostles that has resulted in Christians trying to abolish slavery multiple times and inspiring people to oppose slavery, and this being connected to the doctrine of God. So I just want to read one of the writings of Gregory of Nyssa, who in his homilies on Ecclesiastes in 2:7, in part 4, he writes, among those things he includes is an expensive home, many vineyards, beautiful gardens, pools and orchards. Do we find a person who regards himself as lord over his fellow man? Do you see here a pride which makes false pretensions? Such words as these rise up against God. As prophecy has told us, all things serve God, whose power is over them. As for the person who appropriates to himself what belongs to God and attributes to himself power over the human race as if he were its Lord, what other arrogant statement transgressing human nature makes this person regard himself as different from those over whom he rules? You have forgotten the limit of your authority. which consists in jurisdiction over brutish animals. Scripture says that man shall rule birds, beasts, fish, four-footed animals, and reptiles. However, can you transgress the servitude bestowed upon you and raise yourself against man's freedom by stripping yourself of the servitude proper to beasts? Man, who was created as Lord over the earth, you have put under the yoke of servitude as a transgressor and rebel against the divine precept. And that's back in Roman times, when the whole economy was based on slavery. And what you have is that Christianity, by abolishing the slave trade, and it was the Christian world that abolished the slave trade, the Muslim world would still be trading in slaves today if it were not for Christian pressure. The gunboat, to be fair, and even though we have changed the world and transformed it in this way, many who agree with us and support the idea of opposing slavery attack us still and attack our beliefs about the image of God and about the idea of God's authority over man, and how that prescribes and limits our own authority over one another. You're on mute.
Yes, our video today on the Speak Life channel is all about this. Polly Toynbee, who's a columnist at The Guardian, and she's long been a supporter of euthanasia. She wrote in her article, maybe it was yesterday in The Guardian, that Christians are welcome to their private views, but they should not try and foist the sanctity of life on others. And so my whole video is like, thank God that Christians have been so monstrous as to foist their belief in the sanctity of life. And I kind of did a history lesson, yeah.
Brilliant. And I think we need to cultivate within the church a much better and clearer celebration of pride in Christian achievements, pride in the Christian contribution to civilization, and not allow Christian heroes and Christian contributors to civilization to be claimed by any national identity. You know, William Wilberforce is a Christian that should be claimed by any Christian around the world. He's not just a British man, you know.
Right.
Galileo Galilei. Did I get the name right? Yeah.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
is a Christian contributor to science that should be claimed by any Christian around the world. I think he was Polish. He's not just a Polish guy, you know. And I think we need to recover that as part of our evangelization to the world. That sense of common heritage amongst Christians and claiming the Christian heroes and contributors to the civilization. But
as you've just named Galileo, though. Own goal, Bob. Own goal.
Go on, explain.
Galileo
Galilei.
This is what the pushback is, and you know, and it's.
There's so no own goal there. There's no own goal there. I'll take you on that, Glenn.
I'm playing devil.
Oh right, sorry, I thought you were right.
For those
Your sarcasm
who are
is deadpan.
Yeah. You're in speaker's corner mode. Come on, Bob.
Yeah.
For those who don't like the narrative that we've just set up, a few names kind of spring to mind. What about, and first of all, what about the transatlantic slave trade? They might get into what about the Crusades, and I'm sure you've got many thoughts on that, Bob. But a lot of people will say, oh, Glenn, you said that Christianity kind of was at the forefront of birthing the modern scientific method. What about Galileo? And it's amazing how educated people will say, wasn't he burned at the stake for his views and for going against church teaching? And I think the amount of nonsense that's said about Galileo is indicative of a world that is really committed to thinking of the church as the bad guys. We are so committed to thinking of the church as the bad guys that we don't care what kind of history we do about the Crusades. We don't care about what kind of history we do about Galileo. We will believe any old nonsense. I mean, it was between the Galileo and the Pope, it was just a battle of titanic egos, essentially.
Yeah, it really
Galileo
was.
happened to be on the right side of a scientific dispute that he had no evidence for. His hunch happened to be right. And, the church did weigh in ways that it probably ought not to have when you're thinking about scientific free inquiry. But it was the largest patron of the sciences, of natural philosophy up until that point, that was going. And so its involvement in science was very largely incredibly positive, without which we wouldn't have science.
Yeah.
Did it over-involve itself in the case of Galileo? 100%, but the misreadings of that, I think, are indicative of why people, of how people are so committed to the church is, in this narrative, a kind of mustache-twisting villain. And thank your lucky stars for the Enlightenment and everything that happened, after Christendom, because that's what's gotten us to where we've gotten to. But that telling is just such a nonsense.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the scientific revolution we need to be claiming as a Christian revolution.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. Or rather, let's say we should be pointing out that the scientific revolution was a Christian revolution that got hijacked by others. So a bit like the Iranian Revolution was a socialist communist revolution that got hijacked by Islamists. Like, I know it's a completely different kind of revolution, but that's essentially what happened with the scientific revolution. Christians contributed to this new way of investigating and understanding the world, developing the scientific method, inquiring into nature, recording it, and postulating new inquiries and proceeding and so on, including the falsification method. And that was for reasons not associated with science, but connected to the Christian civil war of the Reformation.
Yeah.
At the Enlightenment, that method was used to replace revelation as the means to inquire into to make value truth claims.
Yeah.
And its power of production and results in real term consequences was intoxicating. We became altars at the god of the machine, and the god of innovation, and the god of technology. And I think we as Christians need to reclaim the birth of that revolution, despite the fact that it was hijacked.
Yeah, and we can take on the chin the fact that there was a lot of very unchristian schism at the Reformation. I happen to be a Protestant. I happen to think it was a very good thing, the Reformation. But I also do not thereby rubber stamp everything that happened in the name of Reformation. And it was incredibly bloody, and there was that civil war, as you say. I often frame it as like, it's like mum and dad are fighting, and so in the next generation, the Protestants and Catholics are fighting. So in the next generation, you just get figures like Descartes who just want to go into their room and shut the door, and and turn in on themselves. Because mum and dad are fighting.
It's a far gentler way of presenting it, but yeah, all right, that works. I can see how that works.
And then the scientific revolution is kind of like, I'm leaving mum and dad, I'm going off to science land, and and they steal the silverware. they in order to finance their trip to science land, they take all sorts of intellectual traditions with them and assumptions with them. So to some degree, Christians need to take on the chin that the turn to science instead of God, we have some blame for that. But on the other hand, I think, like, let's frame it like a scientific hypothesis. Okay, the scientific hypothesis is something like, human beings are the sorts of creatures who can fathom the mysteries of the cosmos, which is an extraordinary thing to think. So Einstein said, the mystery of the comprehensibility of the universe is the greatest miracle, and it's the miracle upon which the scientific method is founded. It's founded on the idea that Homo sapiens, who are clinging to this rock that's hurtling around this sun, can understand the cosmos. Why should that be the case? So the hypothesis is, no, human beings are really apt for exploring the universe, and we can do this. And then let's set to work. And in a sense, the last 500 years of the modern scientific method have been the validation of that hypothesis, that every single scientific advance does not do away with God. It does not, explain more things, and so now the God of the gaps has to shrink. No, every single scientific advance confirms the hypothesis that the universe is precisely as miraculous as Einstein said it was. And what is your explanation for that? Christians say, page 1 of the Bible, I've got humanity made in the image of God. And the image of God was right at the heart of that scientific revolution. We are precisely the sorts of creatures who can do science because of who we are, what God is like, what the world is like, what fallen reason is like. We are precisely, go on.
It's kind of the point that Eugene Wigner made, where he said that mathematics is unreasonably useful.
Yeah.
The unreasonable utility of mathematics in understanding the world around us. And I think it was Galileo Galilei, funnily enough, who said that God, when it comes to the stars, God speaks in mathematics or something like that. I think
that's the alphabet, and
and so because we are made in the image of God, we are able to speak the language of creation. And the language of creation is mathematics, and mathematics allows us to delve into the precise details of the universe in a way that's completely unreasonable for apes. If we're just apes with chemical fuzz in our minds but no soul, and there is no God, and it's just all meaningless, then mathematics itself is an unreasonable thing to discover, and we are discovering the mathematics. That's how most mathematicians experience the reality of mathematics. It's discovery of language. It's not the invention of language, which is. And when you explore the universe, you find that everywhere we look, it looks designed to the finest possible detail. And the only way that the scientific world or the scientific community, which because of its underlying philosophy is committed to a material explanation behind all behind all discoveries, the only way that they can explain the fact that everything we look at, everywhere we look, it all looks designed, is to postulate the idea of a multiverse. It's to postulate the idea of an infinite number of universes, and we just happen to be in the one that looks designed by accident. But there's no physical evidence for it. The only evidence we have is for one universe, and everywhere we look, it looks precise, it looks organized, it looks ordered, it looks structured, it looks codified.
Yeah. And I think the multiverse is in principle untestable, because such a universe has different laws of nature. And therefore
it's religion.
It's such. I mean, it's faith in the most negative sense, and not even a definition of faith that I recognize as a Christian. It is to say that there is this other realm that is kind of our creator somehow, and that we are utterly cut off from by the nature of the case. So I think not only is it unscientific, it's not even a proper sense of like a leap of faith, because faith in the Christian sense is there is a bridge between the unseen world and us. His name is Jesus Christ, and he has entered into history. He's taken our flesh. He has walked our road. He has left footprints. There is a connection between us and the unseen realm that has given us life. And therefore, my faith in Jesus is a much firmer, sturdier, evidence-based thing than faith in a multiverse could ever be. And again, it just comes back to the person of Jesus, doesn't it? Like, I think he makes sense of what is otherwise absurd.
Yes, amen. I would There is one point that I want to pick a bone with you on.
Mm.
And I do this in love, of course. You know that obviously I respect you. Your thesis and Tom Holland's thesis are very similar. You know, Tom Holland described it as secular humanists are fish in a Christian fishbowl. You know, you talk about it as the air that we breathe,
Mm.
and the bone that I pick with both of you is that I wonder. I think you overstress the Christian roots of the Enlightenment. And I want to explain it this way: the Enlightenment. When you look at the early philosophers of the Enlightenment, they 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 use arguments from natural law. They use arguments from natural theology to justify their worldview. You know, and they try to they build on the scaffolding of of natural theology a new civilization in reaction to the Reformation Civil War.
Mm.
And whilst that therefore is Christian in a way, it is a distortion of Christianity. And so my nuanced nitpicking kind of, I've got my bone to pick with you, it's a very small bone, is that I don't think that when you and Tom Holland are making the argument, it's clear that actually this modern world is a distortion of the Christian world. Because it emphasizes, it's all built on natural theology, though obviously everybody's forgotten that. And obviously natural theology is from within a Christian milieu, a Christian paradigm. But it emphasizes natural theology to the exclusion of revelation.
Yes.
And I think when you guys make your arguments, you bring revelation to the fore, but you ignore the fact or don't speak enough about the fact that it's actually natural theology that the early Enlightenment philosophers were building on. They weren't building on revelation. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Even though natural theology emerges from revelation.
Yeah, yeah. And I think probably Tom and I disagree in different ways. So I think Tom is more comfortable talking about, you know, the 1960s are Christian because the Beatles are singing "Love, Love, Love." I'm much more. I try to be more clear that the Beatles are being profoundly Christian-ish and post-Christian in that kind of, and in the 60s. In the 60s, you know, sexual revolution, I think I'm very clear that is a repaganizing in lots of ways and an undoing of the very positive Christian sexual revolution of the first century. So I'm more, I emphasize more the fact that in Matthew 13 terms, in amongst the wheat, there are also weeds. And that is interesting that Jesus right there when he talks about, the kingdom is going to go like gangbusters and it's going to be, you know, yeast working its way through the batch of dough and it's the mustard seed growing into the biggest thing. Yeah, but there's also going to be weeds. Sown by an enemy. And I think that's really important. And what I sometimes try and say to Tom is there needs to be an essence of Christianity. If you're going to say this is Christian, that's Christian, the other thing is Christian, well, what is Christianity? Like, is it just entirely contingent so that, you know, Tom Holland's always using the evolutionary paradigm that, you know, we you know, in the telling of Tom Holland, we've evolved to have 10 fingers, we could have evolved to have 12, we could have evolved to have 8. There's nothing divinely appointed about the 10 fingers within the evolutionary scheme. I think sometimes Tom falls into saying, other times he doesn't, but sometimes Tom says, the way we've evolved human rights, it might have gone the other way, it might have gone this way. It's an entirely contingent sort of thing. And my problem with that is that, okay, well, if the West is Christian, then it's just by definition Christian.
Yeah.
It could take any twist and turn, and you'd still call it Christian. You need exactly right, as you say, you need that revelation from above in order to tether it to something, to the true essence of Christianity, i.e., Jesus Christ. And I think, in a sense, going back to Luther, I think at its best, that's what the Reformation is trying to do, to say not every accretion that happens in the church, not every twist and turn of fallen human beings is necessarily Christian. There needs to be a pole star above by which we navigate and by which we operate. And I think the sort of the Protestant in me wants to say we are bound by the word of God that judges the church, and therefore we can err. I think Tom Holland actually has more Catholic sensibilities, really. And
So when would you say, Glenn? When would you say that West Europe, and particularly Western Europe, stopped being a Christian civilization?
oh gosh,
When can we talk about the end of a Christian civilization?
well, I mean, if you're Eastern Orthodox, you'll say the 11th century. Um,
But I'm not asking an Eastern
yeah.
Orthodox. I'm asking Glenn Scrivener. When do you think that we stopped being a Christian civilization?
I do think Alec Ryrie, as he's a Christian and a historian, he points to the post-war period as kind of the eclipse of Christianity with the successor mythology. The successor mythology has been World War II. The successor mythology has been Adolf Hitler. And that for 1900 years, the West has thought, what would Jesus do, and tried to do it. For the last 100 years, we've thought, what did Hitler do, and let's do the opposite. So we've had a sort of pro-Christ theology replaced by an anti-Hitler kind of
It's an
theology.
interesting way of thinking about it.
And I can kind of see, what ways in which, I mean, interestingly, I think we're now moving beyond that mythology, right?
Before we get to
Yeah.
that, because I do agree with you, but you have is that your answer? Is that where you think we can stop talking about of a Christian civilization is about the 1950s?
It's hard to say. I mean, you might say 1776. I've just alienated all your American
Yeah,
viewers,
I mean, well, funnily enough, I would say that it was in the late 1700s that we stopped being Christian. But it has taken until the 1960s for that to work itself out.
Yeah.
And now we have worked it out, and that process completed in the 1960s, when we're now bouncing off what we became in the 1790s.
Yeah.
Because the Enlightenment saw the nation state and your national identity replace your identity by religion and church. Empiricism and reason replace revelation as the basis for epistemology. Humanity replace itself as the basis for moral conduct instead of Christ. And since World War II, which is World War II is to the liberal secular world what the Reformation was to the Christian world. And since the end of World War II, just as the liberal secular world was trying to get away from Christianity, the now liberal progressive world is trying to get away from the classical liberal world.
Yeah.
And so nation is now being replaced by the individual. Humanity is being replaced by the ego, and truth is your Schleiermachen feelings, your subjective experience. And I think that that's kind of where we are in the process of history.
Yeah.
Your thoughts?
Well, I think the individuals replaced the nation. Obviously, the nation replaced Christendom
Yes, exactly.
in lots of different ways.
Yeah.
So, yeah, even in that transition, sort of the Westphalian settlement is sort of is a very much a secularizing kind of trend. One of the reasons why I mentioned 1776 is just, that edit by Benjamin Franklin when Thomas Jefferson said we hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable, which is
Yeah.
what Jefferson wrote in June of 1776, and Benjamin Franklin put a line through it and said, no, these truths are self-evident. I think, in a sense, the last quarter of a millennium has been the attempt to make his edit work.
Yes, and it's failed.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I actually, I mean, when you gave that talk, I learned something there, because I'd been flirting with the idea that maybe at the American Revolution they were trying to establish a new kind of Christendom, but you kind of killed that idea for me with that point. So you've
The
affected my
great
own.
majority of them were Orthodox Christians.
Yeah.
Something like 53 out of the 58 of them were Protestants, and it was really only those two, like Jefferson and Franklin, were kind of the deists. Thomas Paine wasn't even a signatory on the Declaration. He was the most atheistic of the lot. So they were incredibly Christian people. And they could have founded a republic on the triune God, right?
Yes, they could have.
And instead they went.
Still can, Americans. Still can.
Still can. Make
not too
America
late.
great Britain again. Yeah.
I'm sure that'll go down brilliantly. And I think, but coming back to this issue about natural theology, because I think in terms of us healing the issue in the West, we've got to recognize just how dependent the Western experiment since the 1700s is on natural theology, and we've got to engage with that basis as a way of bringing it back into balance, so that natural theology takes its rightful place under revelation, not obscuring revelation. And I also think we need to because progressive liberalism is completely unattached to anything. It doesn't even have an attachment to natural theology. It's literally just bouncing off World War II.
It's a vibe.
Yeah, it's a vibe, but in terms of the culture, it's like it's functioning as a cancer. It's literally killing the West. And I'm just wondering, what do you think we as Christians can do to get back into the fight with this sort of liberal secular paradigm, both in its classical and in its progressive forms?
I just wrote an article for the Gospel Coalition. It's gone out literally a couple of hours ago, called Low Tide Evangelism. And it's riffing off of Matthew Arnold's poem of 1851 called Dover Beach. And he's at Dover Beach and he is watching the tide go out. And he talks about, well, yes, the sea of faith was once very full, and now we hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar. And what's fascinating about that is in 1851, that was literally the high water mark of church going in England. They'd just done a census. So the 1851 census revealed that 50% of the English were in church on a Sunday. And still, he kind of saw this coming. And so, what do we do about the low tide that we find ourselves in? Well, one thing we can do is prayerfully await the turning of the tide, because tides don't always go out forever. They tend to come back in as well. But I think another thing we can do is recognize the low tide opportunities, because there are certain things that happen at low tide that don't happen at high tide. And so at low tide, you see what lies beneath, and it scares people. At low tide, you begin to recognize the shaping influence that the sea had always had, and you can see more clearly at times the shaping influence that the tide has had at low tide, and sometimes you can see it at low tide better than you can see it at high tide. And at low tide, you can make certain journeys out to Le Mont Saint-Michel or something, across that bridgeway onto the island at low tide, you can walk it. Whereas at high tide, if you're on a surfboard, you might sort of bob your way towards the church. At low tide, there is an
An easy
intentionality
walk.
about making your way to it intentionally rather than just showing up in church. And so at low tide, I talk about different things. So at low tide, you see what lies beneath. And I think it scares a lot of people, rightly, to see some of the progressive liberationist stuff go crazy and to see some of the Nietzschean stuff kind of emerge and raise its ugly head, and Andrew Tate and all the rest of that, and you can see in the woke and the anti-woke at times, you can see things that make you go, oh, yikes. And I think at low tide, it starts. You start to think, maybe Nietzsche was right. Nietzsche said, God on the cross is the transvaluation of all values. We only get our humanism from Christianity. Ditch Christianity. You're not going to have, your humanism anymore. It's will to power from here on in, baby. And I think at low tide, you start to see some of that scariness. And so you start to say maybe Nietzsche is right. I think also at low tide, you start to see the shaping influence of Christendom. Benjamin Franklin literally thought that it was self-evident that we all have human rights. How could he think that? How could he think it's self-evident? He could only think it was self-evident because he was at high tide. He was buoyed up by Christianity. And in a sense, Tom Holland's Dominion would not have sold anywhere near as many copies if it was written even 20 years earlier. If it was written in 1999, we all thought that was the end of history anyway, and progressive, liberalism had swept the world, and liberal democracies are the future, and it's the liberal utopia from here on in. And so
how's that working out, liberals?
How's that working out? But in 1999, that book would have come out, and people would have gone, nah. In 2019, it comes out, and I can see it. It's almost like in the rearview mirror, you see Christianity a lot more. And then I kind of talk about there are some intentional paths that you can step towards Christian faith, whereas people showed up in church because that was the thing that you did. I think now you really have to be a Christian. You're standing against the tide. You're going against the flow. But there's something good about that. And here are some steps that you can sort of take, and I go through them in the article. But essentially, it's going on the journey a little bit like Ayaan Hirsi Ali's journey, where she basically read Dominion at just the right time when she was flat on her back in depression and despair, told by someone to pray about it, and so she prays to Jesus. And her counselor said to her, you seem like you're spiritually bankrupt right now. And Ayaan Hirsi Ali was like, yes, she tried the Islam thing. She tried the new atheism thing. It was very much a low tide moment. And interestingly, in order to solve the spiritual bankruptcy, this counselor said to her, well, let's get God back, in the equation for you. And for Ayaan, she was like, I grew up in fundamentalist Islam. I don't want to go back to that. And so the counselor said, why don't you just invent the kind of God that you could believe in? And so she ends up describing a God that sounds remarkably like Jesus. And then she decides, well, let me not, found another religion. That's never gone that well in the history of humanity. And let's surrender to Jesus Christ. And she's now calling herself a lapsed atheist and going to church on a Sunday. And she just had a beautiful interview with Alex O'Connor, the atheist YouTuber, where she speaks of Jesus so warmly. But there are geopolitical things that are going on that have awoken her to the need for Christ. There are personal issues in her life that have awoken her to the need for Christ. The Tom Holland argument was helpful, at least for her showing up in church. And she now says, I'm just learning so much Sunday by Sunday. And she's submitting herself to that and finding faith, finding peace, finding joy. I think there are a lot of people on the Ayaan Hirsi Ali train, and I'm kind of excited about it.
For me, one of the things that Christians need to be doing is recapturing history, recapturing the telling of history.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly the history of the church. I think another thing that Christians need to be doing is we need to be rediscovering how to create families, because demographically we're ahead of the demographic collapse. We're far ahead of the demographic collapse in the church. I think Christians need to be working together more, not less. I think that, and Christians need to be having a political vision, which is a new Christendom. If we can see the beauty of the old, let's use the best bits of it to start building a new one. And we have to confidently re-engage in culture, not trying to mold Christianity to the culture, but trying to mold the culture to Christianity, and doing so confidently that our own values and that our own beliefs are the right answer for the West now at this time. And to commit to it with zeal and gusto and fervor. The Christian project is where we put all our chips. The Christian project is where we put all our energies. And as our Lord said, when he said, from the time of John the Baptist to this, the kingdom of God has suffered violence, and the men of violence seize it by force. And that's the idea of us pushing all things aside to lay hold of the kingdom of God. Whatever the opposition is it a liberal progressive militant? Is it the new atheist movement? Is it the Islamists? Is it the transgender lobby? That we sweep all opposition aside to lay hold of the kingdom of God.
Yeah. And go on.
And I think this is where we need, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, I just want to extend an invitation to her if she should ever hear this. She represents for me the sort of death of the new atheist project. It failed. The church is still here.
Yeah. I got to interview her back in May, and it was such a delight. She sort of she arrived at the interview, and even before she'd sort of shut the car door, she was like, "Oh, Glenn, I'm just so excited to be here." And she was talking about how excited she was reading the Bible. And she was like, "Glenn, you have no idea. I grew up in Islam." And she said, "Islam is so boring." And then she said, I thought, I thought that atheism would have the answers, but it's almost as boring as Islam. And then she's absolutely effervescing, really, with just the fruitfulness of Christian theology.
Yes.
It is the greatest intellectual tradition in history, and it has the greatest resources. When you think about Trinitarian theology and the incarnation and cross and resurrection and the hope of the world to come, these are just such profound resources to press into, and it's just delightful to see. I mean, she's basically a year and a bit into her Christian faith, and she's finding that there's a depth to this and a substance to this. And her husband Neil Ferguson is he too is a lapsed atheist and going to church and
there's a lot
God in public, and
I think one of the things that the church needs to do better, and this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on, is to the ability to try and communicate how Christianity molded and shaped the world that we live in. Like our concept of individualism was created by the Christian world. Christ in his teaching said you've got to be willing to reject tribe and family and be rejected by tribe and family to join this new covenant people, which is a way of that's a way of atomizing, in a sense, and beginning to fashion the idea of the human individual. But then you've also got the fact that as Christians we teach confession, the idea of confessing to your brothers and sisters, to confess to one another, as it says in James, and that practice that has gone down through thousands of years of people going and confessing their personal sins encourages individual responsibility. And again, the idea of the individual. The idea of vocation, the Christian concept of vocation, the idea that God wants you to do a particular thing and that you should discern what that particular thing is, again, gives this concept of the individual and this idea of finding your way in life. The idea of Christian conscience, that you're answerable to your conscience. Again, it creates this sense of, because your conscience is from God, it creates this sense of an individual identity. And so Christianity has cultivated and nurtured the idea of the individual for over 1,000 years. But then what happens at the Enlightenment, that idea just gets released like an energetic ping pong ball.
Yeah.
But it's not contained within a wider scaffold that gives it order.
Right.
And it doesn't understand that it belongs to a body of people, the covenant people of God.
Yes.
And so, like you quite rightly said, it's like the Enlightenment is taking a whole bunch of different Christian things and just mashing them together in a different order, And I think as Christians, we need to be able to sort of say, look, the Enlightenment brought a lot of good stuff, but it's brought a lot of errors in it. And we can correct those errors by returning to the Christian faith.
Yes. And having a forward-looking faith as well. So there is a whole lot of retrieval that we need to do in all those different areas that you talk about. But with that rich theological heritage retrieved, there are all sorts of problems that face humanity now, for which we have the answers.
Yes.
Not that I know how to think through every facet of artificial intelligence or all the challenges that transhumanists kind of bring, or the effective altruists, or not that we have yet the answers, but we have the resources to think through, like, what actually is intelligence, what actually is consciousness, what is actually a person, what is the meaningful life, the meaningful death, the value of it all. And therefore, we ought to be at the forefront of, considering the new technologies. And isn't it interesting that the sort of the at times very dystopian post-human future that people prophesy is kind of happening right when post-Christianity is gripping us most disastrously.
Yeah.
That might be a sign that the true humanism was Christianity all along, right?
Well, yeah, exactly. You've got you've got people like Desideri Erasmus, and the whole Renaissance movement. Like the very fact that the Renaissance occurred, both shows that Christians preserved the knowledge of antiquity and the anthropocentric perspective, but also was willing to engage with it and not see it as alien, And I think the Renaissance itself prepared and conditioned a lot of people to be quite readily to accept the Reformation when it occurred. You look at Calvin and the way he does his commentaries; he's very much a humanist. In his writings and his thinking.
Yeah.
But I think it's kind of like, because of the Reformation, it was ideas that got out of it ruptured the container. And then the contents spill everywhere. It's like a vase full of marbles, and you smash the vase, and then the marbles just go out in all different kinds of directions and bashing into all different kinds of things and ricocheting all around. And that's where we've been for the last 200 years.
Yeah.
And now it's about picking up all those marbles and putting them back in a vase again.
Put them back in the vase, but also continuing on with. I'm gonna use what might sound like a dirty word. Continuing on being a progressive movement, right? It might sound like a dirty word, but the seventh of the values that I talk about is progress, and I very starkly delineate between the sort of the prophets of progress in the 19th century that
Mm.
were absolute horror shows, um, especially when you think of someone like Karl Marx or
Yeah.
uh, the, these kinds of ideas of progress, where we reach for the workers' paradise and it all ends up with millions dead. 19th century was very much this sort of century of progress, and it ends up with World War I and World War II. You know, it ends up
Mm.
with the murder century in the following century. But the arc of the moral universe, which, you know, right in the middle of the 19th century, that's where the phrase comes from. The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice.
Yeah.
That was actually an abolitionist preacher, Theodore Parker, who first coined that phrase. And there was a belief in progress. And like I said, I think abolitionism was genuine moral progress.
Yeah.
And I think Marxism is genuinely not, right? Um, and therefore, I think Christians need to be discerning about what progress means, but there is a Christian form of it. But I think the Christian form of it is not like a rainbow. You sort of, you know, up
Mm.
we go to the workers' paradise, and we crash down with the gulag. It's much more, well, Martin Luther King Jr. was famous for saying the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. You know, he was the one who died saying, I may not get there with you, but I've been to the
Yeah.
mountaintop, right?
Mm.
And I think he models a different kind of, I'm not saying I agree with everything Martin Luther King said, but he models a different kind of progress, which I think is properly Christian. And therefore, I think that the attitude of the Christian is not simply retrieval,
Yeah.
but it
I
must be
agree.
forward facing. That with the resources of the past behind us, that we can forge a different kind of a future and reform the evils of the past and march forward in the Jesus revolution.
Yeah. I think that's because we're not pinned. Islam is pinned to the 7th century. It's pinned to
Yeah.
Muhammad. So when Muhammad marries a 6-year-old, it's possible for any Muslim to marry a 6-year-old if the right conditions are met. When Muhammad had sex with a 9-year-old, it's possible for any Muslim to have sex with a 9-year-old so long as the right conditions are met. When Muhammad traded in slaves, it's right for any Muslim to trade in slaves so long as the right conditions are met. Whereas in Christianity, because of our belief in a new heavenly kingdom and that time moves as an arrow towards a completion of which the perfection of it is done by the other. It's done by Christ, the Son of Man, when he returns, his great parousia. But also because Christianity only asks us to embody the values and the beliefs, but then to work out our salvation with fear and trembling. It means that Christians can learn so for instance, I'll give you an example. Christ said, it's better that a millstone be tied around your neck and you be thrown in the sea than you cause one of these children to be harmed. Now, that value of children that Christ gave to children was revolutionary in the Roman world. Children had pretty much no value in the Roman world. They were literally disposable, as you said earlier, in rivers and bins and streets, left to be eaten by dogs and such. But that value has meant that as Christians have meditated on that word and acted upon it progressively through different generations, and come to think about, well, how do we make sure children don't stumble? We've increasingly put in more and more protections around children, including such as consistently raising the age of consent.
Yep.
Because we can think, oh, wait, we now understand more about how to protect children and what they need to be protected from. So we can change our laws to accommodate for this new information. And you don't get that in Sharia. They're stuck to Muhammad as being the perfect example in every possible way. Whereas Christians, we see Christ as the perfect example in every possible way, but we have to think about, we're instructed and encouraged to think about, what does that mean to live it out in your circumstance today, based on what you know today. And so I think that is the engine of its progressiveness. Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, the DNA of the mustard seed is still the same as the DNA of the mustard tree,
Yeah.
but there's been quite a lot of growth, right? The yeast working its way through the dough. There is absolutely that sense of progress woven in, and something like slavery. I mean, the Apostle Paul. No wonder he writes the way that he writes to slaves and say, there is absolutely no way that a first century church is going to overturn Greco-Roman slavery.
Yeah.
So what on earth does Paul do? Well, he says, hey, slaves, obey your earthly masters. Masters, remember, you've got a master in heaven. Do not mistreat your slaves, which is precisely the sort of thing you would expect if there is a sort of a slow ferment of Christianity that's increasingly is going to have its effect in cultural matters. So of course, Romans chapter 17 is not the abolitionist manifesto because,
Yeah.
well, guess what? You can't go to Caesar with a petition, right? But what you do is you live out the fact that, you know what, a slave can totally be a deacon in your church, and you've got to obey that slave in the church.
And he can be a bishop.
He could be a bishop, right? And you've totally got to obey that slave, and you're all one in Christ together, and you can save up a lot of money and buy the freedom of a whole bunch of slaves, which is what, Christians did a lot of in the Roman Empire. They weren't able to legally affect anything. It wasn't a democracy. What they could do, they did do, and so there was a gradualism to the abolition of the slave trade, a gradualism that kind of worked in medieval Christendom, because like even your slave was baptized and therefore a member of the same household, and you're all at the same table eating the body and blood of Christ together, your brothers and sisters. There are lots of other things that are happening socially in medieval Christendom. There's plagues coming through and smashing through social societies in all sorts of ways. There's all sorts of economic issues that are going on that might mean that slavery has economic pressures on it to melt away. But at the heart of it, there are these theological matters as well. And yeah, that's another example of the way the yeast works. And sometimes the yeast works such that slavery essentially had melted away, and then the King of France in 1315 sort of puts it on the statute books. Or sometimes it's a lot more like the sort of the 18th century and 19th century in Britain, when there is like a more democratic process and people are marching on the streets and there's petitions, and there's a kind of a popular movement, and they get hold of social media, and they print the Wedgwood medallion that's got the picture of the black man on his knee, taking the knee, and the motto is, "Am I not a man and a brother?" And they absolutely, nailed social media in the day, and that went viral and captured imaginations. But that's a very different movement to the movement in 14th century France. Very different movement to what Gregory of Nyssa is able to do in the 4th century, the sermon that you spoke of. Very different to what the Apostle Paul says in the book of Ephesians, for instance. But it's all part of the same movement. It's the same DNA for the mustard seed, even as it becomes the mustard tree. But there's growth and there's development, there's progress.
Yeah, I think it's worth pointing out that the reason why I think Spain and Portugal got back into slavery, despite the fact that they'd abolished it before the 7th century, is that from the 7th century they had been occupied from the 7th century to the 14th century by an Islamic occupation force that had renormalized slavery into everyday life, so that it had become completely renormalized back into the culture and life of the Spanish and Portuguese people. So that when Islam was finally, when Spain and Portugal was finally liberated from Islamic occupation, it had still left its mark on the culture, which, because by that time, Spain and Portugal were militarized societies. They were Catholic militant societies. That's why you got the conquistadors. And so Islam had kind of left its stamp on Spain and Portugal, and it's through that it had gone back into Europe again. But the Enlightenment had allowed it because it had rationalized it through the use of reason, through the natural theology was used to justify the reintroduction of slavery.
Aristotle in particular.
Yeah, exactly. That's my point. So this is the point that I guess I'm trying to make, is that natural theology, is a distortion of Christianity when it's not viewed in the context of revelation. And it's only when the image of God doctrine starts to get pushed back into culture again, which happens around the 1800s, that you end up with the abolition of slavery once more. So you've got this aberration from the 1600s to the 1800s, where we'd kind of lost sight of the doctrine of the image of man, which we're losing sight of again with the euthanasia and this euthanasia bill. So I think it'd be nice maybe to start rounding off where we started, which is, how as Christians do you believe that we can start fighting against the euthanasia bill? What do you think we can do to start to combat it?
Well, I mean, you talked about, men of violence take it violently, and talk about combat. I guess Jesus has given us the sword of the Spirit by which to do that, and we're absolutely not to take up the sword of steel in violence, but we are absolutely to. I love it in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, to tear down strongholds, right? And to cast down imaginations, as the old Authorized Version put it. That modern secular people, just as first century people, live within their imaginations in the same way that the inhabitants of Jericho lived within those walls. They probably thought of those walls. They think that their imagination is like an IMAX cinema. And the Apostle Paul is saying, no, it's like the walls of Jericho, and those things need to come down. We cast down imaginations. And I think by the sword of the Spirit, we take captive every thought and make it obedient to Christ. It is the telling of the Jesus story in captivating ways that I think is what changes hearts and minds, because we are imagination-driven creatures, actually. And therefore, what are the stories that we can tell about the givenness of life when it comes to euthanasia? Because the other side, they have an imagination, right? They live within a world in which I want to be compassionate to Esther Ranson. For those outside the UK, Esther Ranson, great television personality who has come out all in favor of euthanasia, and she wants to be able to have the choice at the end of her life. I guess she's in her 70s now. She wants to have the choice at the end of her life to determine when she dies. And isn't it compassionate on someone with a terminal illness to kind of allow that? And that's the IMAX cinema that they're living in. This world in which actually Esther Ranson is a very competent, capable, strong woman, very much in charge of herself, who wants death on her own terms. And I think what we need to do to cast down that imagination is to unmask this false sense of compassion, because actually she is not the weak, she is not the most at-risk person at all. You know who the most at-risk people are. It's those who are at the end of life, and the pressure that is either spoken or unspoken, that is certainly felt by almost every elderly person. I'm a Church of England minister. I'm in Eastbourne, which is like the retirement capital of the UK. Like, I'm surrounded by old people, and they feel a burden constantly. They'll be hacking up a lung, and I'll have to like drive them to hospital. I'm fine. I don't want to be a bother. I don't want to be a bother. And there's going to be a conveyor belt. If this legislation goes through, there's going to be a conveyor belt of people who feel like they are bed blockers,
Yeah.
because within the NHS they kind of are, right? Because it's
Yeah.
an utterly failed system.
Because of the breakdown of the family
Yeah,
and
right.
the absence of children.
Yes. Yeah, and so who's going to wipe my bum when I'm too old and senile to wipe it myself?
Yeah.
Well, we might bring in Filipino nurses or something. Like that. That's the sort of the secular solution to the population problem.
More institution,
Yeah,
rather than
right.
the family, the Christian family.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. And
I
so
just,
and so yeah,
yeah.
go on.
No, I was just going to say, because whenever I ask, you know, um, the men with the holy hands, those that you gotta be a Christian to get that joke, but like about
Touch the screen now, people. Touch the
yeah,
screen now.
yeah. you know, just keep the bread and the wine away from him. But in terms of in whenever I ask the men of the holy hands to talk about how we can deal with a problem, they always give the theological answer. And I would want to encourage church leaders that you've got to be able to give the sociological answer as well as you give the theological reasoning, but then give the sociological pragmatics. And I would say that there are things that Christians need to be doing to combat this euthanasia bill. Is firstly, you absolutely need to be getting in touch with your MP. Like go and knock on their door, ring them, send them a letter. Every church leader should be getting everyone in their congregation to do it. All the MPs across the country should feel absolutely harangued by people arguing for pro-life. And look at organizations like CBR UK, and other pro-life organizations to learn what legitimate points and good points to make in your communications with your MP. Also, Christians need to be supporting the hospice movement and
Yeah.
arguing that the alternative to euthanasia is, rather than just finding ways to kill off the elderly, the weak, and the depressed and the vulnerable, is actually we need to be investing in the hospice movement for the dying, so that they can die with dignity, and be cared for with dignity, so they know they're going to be looked after properly. So properly funding the hospice movement, creating communities that can help people who are disabled. I forget what it's called, Lavere. There's a Catholic community dedicated, brings disabled people together with able people, and they live
Is
in
it
community
Labrie?
together.
Not Labrie.
Labrie, maybe,
No.
yeah, sounds about right.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Can't
but
think of it. Yeah. Jean Vanier
you'll
was
find it
part
if
of
you
it,
look
but
it up.
unfortunately, but yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and like creating the institutional movements to counter the culture of death,
Yeah.
as John Paul called it.
Yeah.
And
Larch is the place. Yeah.
Liache,
Larch. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Larche. Yeah.
yeah, Liache, and so and to have the confidence to articulate and the ability to articulate that actually Christ was absolutely right. His fundamental criticism of pretty much all human problems was that there was an absence of love. There was a poverty of love. There was a deficiency of love.
Right.
And at the root of every humanly created problem, if you look at it deeply enough, the thing that is missing is more compassion.
Yeah.
The thing that is missing is more agape, more love.
Yeah.
And I think we need to be better at articulating that as a social critique, as a political critique, as an economic critique in culture.
Yes.
And articulating that love is not some goopy feeling or some sentimentality.
Or some virtue to signal online with the hashtag be kind.
Yeah.
Because push beneath that, and that is whitewash, actually, in a lot of different ways. So I absolutely agree. Yeah, it's what's difficult is the inflated value of the single story about compassion.
Yeah.
The single story about the Esther Ranson at the end of life.
Yeah.
Don't you want to be compassionate on her? And the invisibility of what a change in the Lord does to vast multitudes.
The disabled, the depressed. the elderly that have no
The
family.
frail. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's all good if you're rich, middle class, and self-empowered. But what about the powerless and the vulnerable?
Yeah. Which goes back a little bit to there's a cachet actually to the language of compassion that people want to claim, even if they are forwarding some very cruel policies.
Mm,
At the beginning of life, with the unborn, again, it is forwarded as abortion is forwarded as an option that it's about equality of the sexes apparently, and it's about it's healthcare. It's the compassionate choice, right?
mm,
And so, 250,000 babies were killed in the name of compassion last year,
yeah,
and like, that's an extraordinary sentence for a human being to say. No, nevertheless, it's true. In the
yeah.
name of compassion, 250,000. And so, absolutely, we need to talk the language of compassion, and we need to unmask the counterfeit
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
do a kind of
And
a
the
taste
double
of
talk,
difference. Yeah.
Planned Parenthood. It's nothing of the sort. It's Planned Unparenthood. You know,
Yeah.
it's there's nothing about Planned Parenthood in the activity of Planned Parenthood.
Well, because
Glenn.
I think their first slogan was "We want every child to be a planned child," and you're just like, well, and we're going
Yeah,
to enforce
exactly.
that at the point of the
Yeah.
sword. Like, gosh, okay.
Glenn, we've got to come to an end, and
Mm.
I'm going to close in another psalm. And I thought, since we're in Advent and Christmas is just around the corner, I'm going to close with Psalm 72, which
Oh,
obviously
love it.
has prophecies of the Christ child and of the Magi and the bringing of gifts by the kings of the nations. But as I read it, I want to invite people to remember everything that we've just talked about the Jesus revolution, the Jesus movement, and the love revolution and the compassion revolution, and listen for its echo in what you're about to hear, because this psalm is a prophecy of Christ, and it speaks to who Christ is and what Christ will accomplish. And so just listen to it, given everything that we've just talked about. And this will be our closing prayer. And then I'll play some music to send us out. And if you just wait at the back of the studio, Glenn, we'll 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 uh, we'll have a quick chat about another live stream. Okay, so this is Psalm 72. God, give your justice to the king and your righteousness to the king's son. He will judge your people with righteousness and your afflicted ones with justice. May the mountains bring well-being to the people and the hills righteousness. May he be vindicated. May he vindicate the afflicted amongst the people, help the poor and crush the oppressor. May they fear you while the sun endures, and as long as the moon throughout all generations. May the king be like rain that falls on the cut grass, the spring showers that water the earth. May the righteous flourish in his days, and well-being abound until the moon is no more. May he rule from sea to sea and from the Euphrates to the ends of the earth. May desert tribes kneel before him, and his enemies lick the dust. May the kings of Tarshish and the coasts and islands bring tribute. The kings of Sheba and Seba offer gifts. Let all kings bow in homage to him, all nations serve him. For he will rescue the poor who cry out, and the afflicted who have no helper. He will have pity on the poor and the helpless, and save the lives of the poor. He will redeem them from oppression and violence, and for their lives are precious in his sight. May he live long. May gold from Sheba be given to him. May prayer be offered for him continually, and may he be blessed all day long. May there be plenty of grain in the land. May it wave on the tops of the mountains, and may its crops be like Lebanon. May the people flourish in the cities like the grass of the field. May his name endure forever, as long as the sun shines. May his fame increase. May all nations be blessed by him and call him blessed. Blessed be Yahweh God, the God of Israel, who alone does wonders. Blessed be his glorious name forever. The whole earth is filled with his glory. Amen and amen.
Amen.
Okay, I'm just going to play us some beautiful Advent music to play us out. So I'll see you at the back of studio.